All right. Hello, class. This is a response to week 1, reading reflection 1. And I figure let's take a closer look at the argument that you were asked to analyze. And I'm going to go through using some of the stuff you read in Woodhouse, basically modeling how one might analyze this argument. Hopefully this will answer some of your questions. It might clarify some of my comments that I made on your individual posts. But I find this to be a very important set of skills, right, that is unique to philosophy. How to think well, clearly, how to form arguments that are not filled with contradictions and simply emotional biases. How do we really evaluate our own ideas and the ideas of others to go after good arguments and weed out bad arguments as we pursue truth, right? So this is like a structured way of thinking. Okay, so let's just take a look. So the argument as posed in the prompt is on the PowerPoint here. Let's see, let me get my little arrow. I broke it into premises here, and I encourage you to do this because sometimes it's helpful to break it down rather than just seeing it in a paragraph like that. So premise 1, every human has the potential for redemptive transformation. Premise 2, if an action thwarts this redemptive potential, it is immoral. Premise 3, the death penalty thwarts this potential. Conclusion, therefore, the death penalty is immoral. I'm not going to say much now. I'm just going to go through these two, and then we'll sort of come back to them. This argument was followed up by an example, and the example is essentially an inductive argument by analogy. So to help you, this is a deductive argument. I talked about this in my first lecture that you should have listened to already. A deductive argument means the structure is such that if you accept the premises, you must accept the conclusion. If you look at the structure of this argument, if you accept those 3 premises, you must accept the conclusion. That's deductive. This is an inductive example, and it's trying to make an argument. It's an argument by analogy. An inductive argument is not an argument by necessity, where if you accept the premises, you must accept the conclusion. An inductive argument is an argument by probability. If you accept the premises, it makes the conclusion more probable, but it doesn't make it necessary. And the analogy is pretty simple. You bring up Paul, you say Paul was a murderer, he was killing innocent people, he was persecuting innocent people as part of the church. Given Old Testament law and the current U.S. law, whatever, this deserves death. And yet, Paul had the potential to be redeemed. And we see this, right, in Acts. Paul is redeemed and transformed. And so thank goodness he was never executed, because he then goes on to write 2/3 of the New Testament. The analogy is, and all the prisoners on death row have the same potential Paul had for redemptive transformation. Not that they all will be transformed, but they have the potential. Any one of them could. So to execute someone is to potentially thwart that person from being redeemed, transformed, and then all the good that they might do as a result of that transformation. So you're creating an analogy between Paul and the other inmates on death row. Now, whether that's a good analogy or not is up for debate, but that's the analogy that the author of the argument's trying to make, right? So you've got a deductive argument and an inductive argument, both trying to support the same general conclusion. Okay, so analysis. The first thing I said is, okay, well, does this argument fit the definition of critical thinking established by Woodhouse? Some of you did not address the actual definition that Woodhouse gives. It's so vital in these prompts and in your responses to these prompts that you address the reading for the week. So if I say apply Woodhouse's definition to the argument, then you need to give me Woodhouse's definition and then say, and this is why it fits the argument, or this is why it does not fit the argument, right? Some of you just went straight into saying, oh, this isn't good critical thinking, or this is good critical thinking. But I'm asking you to tell me that in light of the definition, and so that's what you need to be using. And the definition here is critical thinking is purposeful, goal-directed thinking that follows a principled, reasoned track. Now, if we go back to this argument, it is purposeful, there's a clear purpose, it's moving from premise to conclusion, there's a necessary link between premises and conclusions, such that if you accept one, you have to accept the other. So there's a principled thinking, a goal-directed thinking. this meets the definition of critical thinking, clearly, right? Now, you can still disagree with the conclusion, but the way the argument's structured, it fits, right? This is a good piece of critical thinking in terms of the way the argument's structured, and yet it can still be false. Strong and weak forms of critical thinking. There was some confusion on this among students, so I want to try to clarify. Weak form does not mean the argument is weak. Some of you confused that. You thought weak form of critical thinking meant weak argument. No. It just means there are different forms of critical thinking. A weak form does not mean the argument's weak. It means the argument's trying to do a certain kind of thing. A strong form does not mean the argument's strong. It means that the argument's trying to do a different kind of thing, right? Weak arguments are here to deflect challenges, right? To advance one's own position. A strong form of critical thinking not only does those things, a strong form of critical thinking takes a step back and begins to question one's own assumptions, one's own premises, right? So it's more than just me putting an argument forward to try to win the debate. It's more than me just trying to deflect objections. It also says, and I'm going to be self-reflective and criticize my own view and think through it openly and honestly, right? Most people are not willing to do that. When you listen to talk radio, very rarely do the people calling or the host step and actually begin to criticize their own assumptions and views and to really be self-critical in a way to pursue truth. It's mostly a weak form of critical thinking, where it's, I'm going to deflect objections, I'm going to put forward my own ideas. Same thing when we turn on the news, same thing often when we get into religious debates. Now, this argument's not much different. In this case, you see the person putting forth an argument, you see them trying to deflect objections by giving you an example, right, afterward. You see the weak form of critical thinking, but at no point does the argument become self-critical. At no point does the argument begin to question its own assumptions and raise certain questions of itself, and therefore it never participates in a strong form. It stays at the weak level, and that's okay. It's a short argument, right? It's like 6 sentences long. It can't do everything, but it never goes into that strong territory. Just to clarify, I think there was some confusion by students on that. Okay, 3 types of statements. This is another thing I asked. What kinds of statements are being used in this argument? Again, there was some confusion among students. Many of you talked about these statements being a priori. But I want you to go back and look, right? A priori statements are statements that are true by definition. A priori statements are statements that can be true without the benefit of sense experience. A priori statements are pretty rare, right? So if we look at each of these, the statement, every human has the potential for redemptive transformation. Is that true by definition? Maybe if we gave you the definition of a human, and if the definition of a human had the notion of redemptive potential in it, then maybe this would be a priori. But in the absence of any of those definitions, this needs to be verified through sense experience. I need to see if human beings have redemptive potential. The example of Paul is trying to give you an empirical example of redemptive potential. So this is an empirical claim, not an a priori claim. It is not known through definition. It is not known in the absence of sense experience. This sentence here, premise 2, if an action thwarts this redemptive potential, it is immoral. Is this true by definition? I don't think so. What definition is this true by? It's not true without sense experience, really. Instead, it's a normative claim. It's making a, right, remember, normative claims make moral judgments, justifications, or evaluations. But they're dealing with moral things, shoulds, oughts. You have a key here. Immoral is in the sentence itself. This is a normative claim saying thwarting the movement from potential to actual is immoral. That is a normative claim, right? Same thing with this conclusion. The death penalty is immoral. That is a normative claim. Premise 3 here. The death penalty thwarts this potential. Is this true by definition? Is this true in the absence of sense experience? To me, this looks like a clear empirical claim. How do I know that the death penalty thwarts the redemptive potential? because I see that in death there is no more ability to make choices, right? Death is sort of the end of this life. And so it looks very empirical. One might argue it's a priori given the definition of death, and so that's okay, but some would argue the afterlife allows for the redemptive potential to continue, and maybe death is not the end. So I would allow for this to be a priori in light of the definition of death, but I think it's a stretch. I think this is probably empirical. Overall, though, this argument is normative. It's not a priori. It's normative. It's making a moral argument. Now, the form is a deductive form, which some of you mistaken, like you thought that was a tautology, right? But remember, I'm asking about individual statements. The argument as a whole is deductive, meaning if you accept the premises, you must accept the conclusion. But none of the individual statements themselves are a priori. So I hope that helps. And if we look at the example, it would be similar. Paul is not a priori. That we only know Paul through reading the Bible, which is sense experience, right? We only know about Paul's redemption because of our sense experience and history. This more generalized claim, a similar kind of redemption can happen to anyone, looks empirical. I've got to verify this, but this is the case. So again, I don't see many a priori statements here. If you have questions, I can try to help with that, but hopefully that clarifies. And here's the definition of a priori. Sense experience is inadequate or unnecessary. They give general information, but not information about the world. They're often definitional, true by definition. So hopefully these will help. And then, of course, normative statements, make moral judgments, evaluations, justifications. So, all right. So now let's go back and let's really analyze. One of the things that I want you to do when you're looking at these arguments is to look at them and think to yourself, okay, let's say I disagree, right? I think the death penalty is not immoral. I disagree with this. Why do I disagree with this argument? Right? Let's really look at the argument and think, where is it that I disagree? What is unsupported? What is unclear? Right? So one of the first things you want to ask yourself is, when I look at premise one, every human has the potential for redemptive transformation. Do I disagree with this? Right? Remember, this is pretty much written to a Christian audience. The argument is geared towards Christians. We're using Paul as an example. We're talking about redemptive transformation, which is a very religious concept. So if I'm writing to Christians, this is a claim that most Christians, I think, would agree with, that every person has the potential, right? Who is outside of God's reach? Who is outside of God's redemption, right? Can't God redeem and transform anyone, any heart? If so, then premise one is acceptable, right? I think most of us can also agree that death thwarts this potential. If someone dies, their chance at earthly redemption, at least, their chance at earthly transformation where they can accept Christ and begin to do the Lord's work on earth as it is in heaven, even if that means doing the Lord's work in prison, it seems that that ends in death because they enter a different existence, right? So I think most people can agree that death, killing someone, thwarts the earthly potential for transformation and even maybe potentially salvation. Well, if premise one and premise three are, for the most part at least, widely accepted, it seems like our focus would be on number two, and some of you pointed this out very astutely. Premise two says, if an action thwarts this redemptive potential, it is immoral. This is kind of controversial, right? Is all activity that thwarts redemptive potential immoral? Is every kind of killing that thwarts redemptive potential immoral? If an intruder breaks into my house and I protect my family and the person happens to die, was that immoral because I took away their redemptive potential? Is this a universal? Does it only apply to people that have already been locked up so that society is safe? There's a lot of questions with premise two. There's a lot of things you could question here, and many of you rightly pointed that out, and I think that that's an important thing when you're thinking critically. If I disagree, where? Where are the weaknesses? The strong form of critical thinking allows you to do this for your own thinking. Write out your own arguments. Why do you believe the things you believe? Can you make an argument and then say, and where is that argument weak? Where does that argument need more clarity? Where does that argument need more consistency? Some of you also rightly pointed out redemptive transformation. What in the world does that mean? That's not very clear. So remember, we've got, right, how to evaluate philosophical arguments, clarity, defining your terms, right? Well, all of a sudden now, redemptive potential, I don't see a definition for that. What do you mean? The person would have to give more information. What does redemption really look like? So I think that that's important. I also think the idea of thwarting potential, what do we mean by this? How does this look? Is also key. And some of you brought these points up, right? So these are some of the ways, the legitimate ways I think we can attack this argument, or at least begin to question it. And maybe the person can come back and give us the definitions and clarify premise too. But without that, we have questions. The example. Many of you had problems with the example, and I want to address a few of these. Some of you said, well, look, Paul was redeemed and transformed, but not everyone on death row will be transformed. There's no guarantee that those people would do that. That's true. But let's look at the argument. The argument doesn't say that all people will be redeemed that are on death row. It says all people have the potential to be redeemed. All people could be redeemed the way Paul was. Not all will, but we don't know which ones will and which ones won't. So killing them eliminates those potential Pauls, right? So that's the first thing. The fact that not all will does not hurt the argument, because all they need is to show you that all have the potential. Some of you argue that, how do we know that Paul deserved to die, right? He's not breaking the laws of Rome. I mean, he's breaking Jewish law, and he's a Jew. But certainly, he's not breaking the earthly laws necessarily, although he is killing innocent people. But I'm not sure that this gets you off the hook. For instance, it's not just Paul who was an evil sinner who broke the law in such a way that I would argue is worthy of death, according to Old Testament law at least. Almost every single major biblical figure fits the same definition. Moses murders an Egyptian. He broke Jewish law. He broke Egyptian law. He deserves to die. Thank God he wasn't killed, though. Thank God that God redeemed him so that he could go and free Israel from Egypt. That forgiveness and redemption changed the history of Israel. David commits adultery and then murder. He breaks his own laws, and right, the Jewish laws, which now the government and the Jewish law, the two laws are fused into one. He should be executed, but he's redeemed and becomes an incredible king for Israel, and sets their path straight. Although it goes crooked with other kings, he certainly encounters this redemption. Abraham is a liar. He is an adulterer, right? And again, according to the law of his people, was guilty of lots of wrongdoing. Redemption. Noah, right, is drunk and naked after the flood. I mean, all of these people are fundamentally flawed. Many of them, not all, but many of them deserved death, according to the laws. And yet God's redemption reached them, right? So Paul is just one example among many in the Bible we could give. Isn't it true that those people on death row have the possibility, the potential of that same redemption? Doesn't death thwart that, right? Maybe that argument is weak, but for those of you that were so focused on Paul and whether he was breaking the laws of the land or just the laws of God, I think there are too many examples in the Bible for that to work. However, some could argue, right, that God selectively chooses those individuals that God will redeem, like David, like Moses, like Paul, and that nothing the Pharaoh can do would stop that. Nothing our criminal justice system can do could stop that redemption, right? That if God wanted to redeem those on death row, those few individuals, God will give them pardon. God will, right, find them innocent. God will save them for God's purposes. And we don't need to ignore the death penalty to allow for God's redemptive potential, because maybe nothing can stop that. You could take a different track to try to thwart this argument, but the way many of you tried, I think, didn't quite work. So I hope this helps you think through this argument, see it in light of some of the Woodhouse definitions, and really the purpose is to learn how to analyze these things well, both the thoughts of others and ourselves. If you have any questions, let me know, and I'll look forward to